Hi, this is Craig Stocks here for Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. And this is part 2 of a video walking through the entire capture and processing workflow for the Wizard Nebula. In part 1, we talked a little bit about doing some research on the target. We talked about the capture process using the PlaneWave CDK 12.5 at the remote observatory. This is the same telescope, and there's also a Takahashi FSQ 106 over here. These are available to rent by the hour if you want to do your own imaging. And if you rent by the hour, you get the files just like we're working with here. If you're interested in exploring monochrome imaging or a longer focal length than you have available, or something that needs a really dark sky, we'd be happy to work with you to work out a time for you to kind of use our equipment. We'll help you get everything set up and run it, and then you get the files. So basically the remote computer is on the telescope. It's operated by the Google Remote Desktop connection from my home computer, and I get the folders over Dropbox. Software resides on the remote PC to operate the telescope, and on my home PC to do the processing. For the Wizard Nebula, we captured a sequence of hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur in 10-minute or 600-second exposures. I would basically capture 3 at a time, move to the next one, and then repeat that cycle. We had a good clear night last night when I ran that sequence. Occasional wind gusts knocked out a few of the subs, but overall it was a good night with good seeing at 2.23 arc seconds. And we did have quite a bit of moonlight, as you can see from the sky quality chart from last night. So the sky was not completely dark because of the moonlight, which the moon came up pretty much as the sun set. So it was moonlight most of the night. We did go through PixInsight, and the steps there were using Blink to remove bad frames, WBPP to calibrate and integrate, or you might call stacking the images. We then stretched the stacked images, extracted the stars with Star Exterminator, and then saved everything as 16-bit TIFFs. And then what we're going to go through now is the process in Photoshop, first with a quick detour into ImPPG to do some deconvolution sharpening, and then we'll load everything into Photoshop, convert to the RGB color space so that we can develop colors. We'll organize layers, set blending modes to allow the stars to show, and then start working on color mapping and fine-tuning, and eventually we'll save that as the master file. So just as a reminder, this is where we left off in PixInsight. We have the hydrogen starless layer, the sulfur starless layer, and the oxygen starless layer. Plus we created a composite grayscale that we're going to use as a luminance layer for detail. So with that, let's go ahead and close PixInsight. And the next step is to go into ImPPG. And as I said earlier, it's a bit of a one-trick pony. It does have histogram and curves functionality as well. You'll see me occasionally drawing things in from the second monitor. What we're using it for here is really just deconvolution sharpening. And it's nice because it doesn't have very many controls at all. All you can do is apply your deconvolution sharpening in different amounts and with different iterations. I find 50 works pretty well. I don't know if it does better or worse than deconvolution in PixInsight, but deconvolution sharpening in PixInsight has lots of controls. This doesn't, so it's easy to use. So with that, let's open our file. And if you recall, we saved the SHO grayscale composite image for luminance. So I'm going to open that, and they usually come in zoomed in too much. This little dotted area is a preview window where it's going to apply the sharpening settings over here. So I'm going to redraw that in an area that I'm more interested in, and then zoom in a little bit so we can see it. And what we want to do is experiment generally with the sigma slider. And as we move it over, if you watch down at the lower left, you'll see that as we move this slider, it updates and applies it in the preview window. Likewise with the unsharp mask. If we want to add a little bit more unsharp mask, we can. It's a little strange because as you move the slider, it always pops back to center. So you see the values change, but then it pops back to center. I find normally somewhere in the low 3s works pretty well for my combination of telescope and camera. The ASI 6200 is a 62 megapixel camera, so it's pretty high resolution. So this looks pretty good to me. So now that we're happy with it here, I'm going to switch to the full frame, which this icon fourth from the right will apply these settings to the whole image. And if you watch along the lower left here, you'll see that it does take longer, where the preview window happened in maybe 1 second. Depending on the size of the window, it may go faster or slower. When you apply it to the whole image, it takes about 10 seconds or so. So now it has updated that, and we have this whole image sharpened. So I'm going to save this with the save image file, and I'll just quickly navigate to my D drive where I have my images saved. And there's the Wizard Nebula, there's the original, and I'm just going to add the word decon for deconvolution sharpened on the end of this, and you'll see it's being saved as a 16-bit TIFF. And it does seem to only work with grayscale images, so if you try feeding this a color image, I don't think it will. It'll just give you the grayscale version. So we're done with that. I'll close this, and now let's hop into Photoshop. And I like Photoshop partly because I'm comfortable with it. I've been a photographer for decades. I've been doing digital imaging since the mid-90s. So digital processes on computers like Photoshop are just kind of second nature to me. But beyond that, it also lets you work visually rather than numerically. Where with pixel math, it always seems like you start by putting together an equation. With Photoshop, you use relatively few tools, but once you get comfortable with them, you can work visually. Excuse me. So if you've watched any of my videos before, you probably know what I'm going to do next. I'm going to go to File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack. And what this will do is let us open all of these files that we just saved. So we've got the stars, the hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur, and then we want the deconvoluted, sharpened version of the luminance layer. We don't need this last one. And I was just holding the Control key to successively click the files that I want. Click OK. It loads those into the list. Click OK again. And now Photoshop will load those files, and we'll see them come in over on the right-hand side in the Layers panel, or sometimes called the Layers stack. And the first thing we need to do is a little bit of housekeeping, because they almost never come in the order that I like to work with. So we do have the star layer on top. Let me close the history panel. We've got the star layer on top, so I want to put each one of these into a group and then give the group a name just for housekeeping. That also lets us apply adjustment layers within each group to adjust each one independently. So Control G on the keyboard is a shortcut to create a group with this layer. I'll double click on the group 1 name and change it to stars. And we're going to change this to lighten blending mode. And you'll see when I do that, everything disappears except for the stars, because everything else on this layer is black. So all we see now is the stars, and we can see the underlying layer. Now on Windows, when you change the blending mode in this drop down, it changes the focus to that dialog, so you do have to press escape to get away from it. so that your keyboard and controls will start working again. I can collapse that with the disclosure triangle. Hydrogen is next in the list. Control G to put it in a group. Double click, name it hydrogen. And then I'm going to just go ahead and collapse it and move it down to the bottom. And I'm going to pause while I see who's on the phone. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about the pause. That was the propane company. We're setting up a backup generator for the remote observatory, and we need to get a propane tank delivered, and I didn't want to miss the opportunity to talk to them about that. So we've got the hydrogen layer down here, and the next one on top is oxygen. So again, I'll just Control G to drop that into a group, double click and give it the name of oxygen. And I generally like to have my oxygen layer right above hydrogen, so I'll move it down to the bottom of the stack. Next is sulfur. Control G, change the name to sulfur. I'll go ahead and collapse it and move it down. And the last one here is the sharpened combination of all three. And again, we'll drop that into a group. Change the name to luminance decon. And I know I'm going to want this, or I'm pretty sure I'm going to want this in luminosity blending mode. So I'll just go ahead and change it to luminosity. And you'll notice that's not available. The reason it's not available is these files all came out of PixInsight, and these are all grayscale images. And since we want to generate color, we need to convert these into color images. To do that, we'll go to the menu option Image, Mode, and you can see grayscale is checked. I want to click RGB color. It will ask me if I want to merge these layers. No, I don't. I want to keep them separate, so I'll say don't merge. And sometimes you'll notice a little bit of a change in brightness when you do that, just because the way grayscale versus RGB interprets the values in an image is a little bit different. So now we can set this in luminosity mode and hit escape to take the focus away from that drop down. And now we've got everything organized, and I'm going to turn off both the stars and the luminance mode for the time being. And I think I'll go ahead and turn off sulfur. So on the bottom we have oxygen, and then below that hydrogen. And we want to make a color image. And to start with, let's just make this a simple HOO image. And I'm debating if I want to, what I want to do with this. I think I'm going to take that out. So to take that out, I'm going to, in this case, it's in an area that's pretty much featureless. Looks like we've got something, kind of a remnant left here also. If I turn the stars on, this is a glow around a star, and this one may just be a little bit of a dust mite. But in either case, I'm going to take these out with the healing brush. I see most people use the clone stamp. I think the healing brush works better. It works like the clone stamp tool in that you alt click to select a source, and then as you paint over it, it copies from the source area to the destination. The big difference is it actually does some blending along the way. So it uses content aware and kind of blends things in for a natural look. And let's look at our hydrogen layer. It looks pretty good by itself. Got another dust bunny up here. I'm just going to go ahead and, yeah, if this had been in a more detailed area, I would probably be a little bit more cautious with using the healing brush to take these out. Really the right way to do it is by burning and dodging to darken or brighten those areas. In pretty much solid areas, I'm not as concerned about it, so I'll just use the healing brush to knock those out. So I've got that cleaned up a little bit. A little one down here. Let's make this into a color image, and we're probably going to need to come back and adjust the brightness of the layers, which will change the color. That's the beauty of this approach. But what we want to do is, let's make an HOO image first. So hydrogen in the red channel, oxygen in the green and blue channels. To get there quickly, if I double click to the right of the layer name, that will bring up the advanced blending options dialog. You can also get to it under layer, layer style, blending options. Either way, you come to the same place. And notice in the center, we have these checkboxes for R, G, and B. So right now, this group is contributing red, green, and blue, all three. And since it's a gray image, monochrome image, it has all three channels, but the channels are all equal. So red, green, and blue are all the same value. Therefore, there's no color. It's just neutral. If I turn off, for instance, the red channel, that leaves just green and blue. So oxygen would be contributing the blue channel. Since hydrogen is contributing all three, the green and blue from oxygen replaces hydrogen, but then the red from hydrogen comes through. So if I turn off the red on the oxygen layer, we now have a color image. And it's in the HOO color palette. It looks like there's a little bit of something here. So again, since it's blue, I can tell that that's on the oxygen layer. We can take it out with the healing brush. This is probably one that you might want to go back and actually do it the right way with with burning and dodging. So now we have a simple HOO image. Got kind of a cyan cast in the dark areas. So let's start with the hydrogen layer, and I'll turn off oxygen for a minute. And this looks pretty good. This looks like the darkest area down here. When we turn on oxygen, we're getting quite a bit of oxygen, just kind of general noise. So probably our dark level is too bright in the oxygen. To fix that, let's go to the oxygen layer, and I'm going to click on the levels adjustment layer. And that by default adds an adjustment layer above the currently selected layer. We were on the oxygen layer, it added it just above. And we can change the black level of cyan just by sliding this black point slider in. And as I do, you'll notice that that blue cyan cast goes away and it becomes neutral, and then some of that background hydrogen starts to show through. And if we turn this layer off, we can see, sure enough, there is some hydrogen clouds out here. So that is appropriate to let that show through. And in fact, we might want to come down to the hydrogen layer, add a levels adjustment layer, and even bring that out a little bit more, and then pull its black point slider in so that we get nice, reasonably black points. So at this point, we have an HOO color image. It might look odd to you because it's kind of upside down from what you normally see. So let's just go to image rotation, and we'll rotate it 180 degrees. That's probably the orientation that you're more used to seeing. If we wanted to turn on our luminosity layer, this is, if you recall, this is in luminosity blending mode. When I turn this on, that adds the brightness and the sharpness that comes from that layer. It's probably a little brighter than we want. So again, we'll open it up, click on the layer itself, add a levels adjustment layer above it, and then we might want to play with the brightness here to make it however bright or dark we want. Essentially what we're doing is we're taking the tone from this sharpened layer, and then we're taking the color from all the layers below. So if we want to change the brightness of the background, ultimately we'll do it right here. Let's add the sulfur in. Oh, and if we wanted to add the stars, the stars are sitting up here, currently turned off in lighten blending mode. Probably a better choice would be screen blending mode. The difference is in lighten blending mode, stars that are over bright nebula areas won't show up, where when you put it in screen blending mode, then they all show up. And if we want to adjust the size or the details of the stars, we can do that. In fact, we'll come to that later. And since these were taken from monochrome data, the stars are all white. There's no color in them. I probably will go back and shoot some RGB data on this target to get just to get the stars in color. So let's add some sulfur. An easy way to do it with an HOO image is just to add some sulfur in the red channel. So I'll turn on the sulfur layer, double click to the right of the name, and that brings up this blending options dialog. And I'm going to turn off the blue layer so that we get some orange from the sulfur. And then I'm going to put it in lighten blending mode. And what that does is any place where it will lighten the background, and where it can't, it doesn't do anything. So now we're getting orange from the sulfur layer, and we're getting green and blue from the oxygen layer. And let's bump up that blue. We haven't really, we've darkened the background, but we haven't lightened it. If we pull the white slider in and then we pull this midpoint slider in, we can really start to bring out that blue, and that may brighten the background to the point that we need to tone it back down a little bit. But that brings out a lot more of that blue in the oxygen. And it also, since we're just lightening with the sulfur now has less effect. We might want to do the same thing with the hydrogen. If we add a little bit more brightness to the hydrogen, and again, we may have to play with the black point to find a nice balance. And last, we may want to come to the sulfur, add a levels adjustment, and possibly bring in even a little bit more of that. So it's starting to become a nice color image now. If we turn off the luminance layer, we can see without the luminosity and with luminosity. We might come back here, play a little bit with the brightness. Notice I'm working with a black background. If you right click outside the image area, you have a default color. You can choose black, dark gray, medium gray, or custom. And when I did custom, I chose white. So that lets me quickly go back and forth between a white background, a black background, or a dark gray or medium gray background. And looking at images on different backgrounds will change your perception of what the image looks like. Let's add a hue saturation layer at the top and pull up our saturation a little bit. And we might even want to add a color balance layer and possibly tweak the color balance. Find something that suits our goal for this image. And really the color balance should probably be below the hue saturation. And notice you can just grab and drag them up and down. So maybe something like that. If we want to target individual layers, such as darkening the red, we can go to this hue saturation. We can choose, instead of the master channel, we can choose just reds, and we can change the contrast, or the saturation. We can change the brightness of just the reds. We can even change the hue of the reds if we want to fine-tune that appearance. So that's kind of a nice pastel version that we've got good sharpness and detail from our luminosity channel. We can play with the colors to bring out the colors the way we want. We can turn the stars back on. and we're getting pretty close to a usable image. One other thing we might want to consider, I'll turn the stars off momentarily. We've got a little bit of vignetting and some odd things happening around the edges. So let me fine tune our blue here. We've got some vignetting in the corners, especially in the oxygen. One of the tricks I like to do is at the very top of the stack, just below the stars. I'll add a solid color, and I'll make this a very dark gray, something in the 15 to 20 points range for RGB, and you want to make sure that RG and B are equal so that it's a neutral gray. Click OK. And of course, in normal blending mode, that just obscures everything. Again, if I change this to lighten blending mode, what it does is it will lighten anything that's darker than that, and I can turn it on and off to see what it's affecting. It's mostly just affecting in here right now. But if I come back and add a blank layer with the plus layer icon at the bottom right, I can paint on here with a brush, and let's go with something like 20%, 30% flow, and just paint with black. And what that does is it darkens what's below, but this layer above keeps it from getting any darker than what we want. So I may want to add another levels adjustment here to play with the brightness a little bit more. I can either do that here or I can do it with the luminance layer. Generally, I would have a little bit more color saturation. So that's an HSO image where we're using oxygen and hydrogen primarily, with some detail added from sulfur. And because we're keeping all the layers intact, we can come back and add a little bit more sulfur detail. Notice it's getting really green in the sulfur. Let's change the color of the sulfur. Right now, sulfur is red and green. If I add a curves layer, and this is above the levels, but still within the group, I can target the green of sulfur, grab this right side of the curve and pull it down. And as I do that, you'll notice that the green turns to more of an orange. So you can kind of fine tune the color that the hydrogen is going to represent by playing with this curve in the colors that it's contributing. So we want it to contribute some yellow but not green. So we may need to turn up the red a little bit. And again, like I say, you can play with this visually rather than numerically, which is something that I like to do. And then let's turn up the brightness a little. See what we're dealing with. Now, green isn't all bad, but generally we want this to be more yellow than green. So that's kind of the idea. That's producing an HOO color image. We can turn on the stars, and there's a more or less finished image. Let's fine-tune the stars a little bit. I'm going to add a levels adjustment layer because within reason, you can change the black point and the midpoint slider of the stars, and see they get a little bit darker when we darken the black point and the midpoint. So you can play with that a little bit. If you go too far, it starts to look odd. Sometimes you have too many small stars that you may need to knock out. If this is a color image, you might have your own color balance and hue saturation adjustment layers just for the stars independently. But yeah, I think that looks pretty reasonable. So at this point, I would go to File, Save As, and notice I haven't flattened anything. All the layers are intact. And I will save this in my 2022 photos. Change the file type to a large document format, which is PSB. And I'll just name this Wizard HSO, and there were around 9 each of O3 and S2, plus the deconvolution. And just click Save, and it will save that finished image. The beauty now, if I come back later today or tomorrow or next week or next month, all these layers, all these settings are all still intact, and I can just pick up where I left off. Or I could even load this image and say, you know, I want to switch that to a Hubble palette SHO. Well, we'll just turn the stars off so we can see what we're doing. We'll turn off this black layer, and we'll momentarily turn off everything in between. I'll even turn off the luminance layer. For an SHO, we want sulfur to contribute red. So I'll just switch it to red and normal, or typically pass through is the default for a group. And then oxygen, we currently have green and blue. We'll just capture blue from there. And we now have an SHO image. And again, we can play with the contribution of each one to get more blue. We may want more green or less green, just depending on what your preference is. We may want more red from the sulfur to counteract some of that green. So that gets us to something like that. We can turn on then the luminosity. And in this case, I think I'll brighten that up a little bit. Darken the background. So it's somewhat trial and error to get to a good starting point. And then at this point, I would typically start playing with color balance. These were set for the previous image, so we'll find some combination that looks good here. If you find it's getting darker and lighter as you move the color balance sliders, what you can do is change this from normal blending mode to color blending mode, and that'll keep it from getting darker or lighter. We can even go to hue saturation, and I'll reset this. And let's target the yellows, and we can play with the hue of the yellows. We can target the cyans and make them a little bit more blue if we want. So you can play with individual colors in the hue saturation. I don't know that we need any more levels here. If you remember, we used this black layer or dark gray layer and a blank layer where we could paint black. And if you have areas that are just not looking right, for instance, we got a lot of blue and red going on in the dark areas, we can approach this a couple different ways. Probably the right way to approach it is to add a levels adjustment layer. I'll add a new adjustment layer here, and we'll target just these areas. And to make it easy, let's grab a color sample and we'll drop it right here. And if we look at our color samples, we can see that we're at 23, 11, 45, red, green, and blue. We want those to all be equal. So we'll start with red, and let's take the red down to about 14. Our green is at 11, so we actually need to brighten it. So to brighten it, we'll use the lower slider, which moves our black point up. And lastly, we'll go to blue, and we really need to knock out a lot of blue to bring it down to 14. So now this area is blacked out, and you'll notice it got quite a bit darker. What would that look like in just luminosity or just color mode? In color mode, it stays around 18. I guess that's okay. So that neutralized this background. I think it also probably affected the central part here. So you could mask this so that it only affects the background. And to do that, we would click on the mask itself. If I click on the little icon, it shows me the level adjustment. If I click on the mask layer, now I can paint with black on the mask. So I'll grab the paintbrush. I have black as my foreground color. Make the brush a little larger. And if we just paint in the center with black, what we're doing is removing this adjustment from affecting that portion of the image. And you can see how on the little mask thumbnail, we can see where we've painted with black. The other thing we can do if we want to just knock this out is we can come to this blank layer. Let's go to something like 20% opacity and just neutralize it this way. I'm sure people are cringing as I do this because it's not really the right way to do it. But what that's doing is darkening this layer so that the plain black is what shows through. Turn on our stars, and there's a somewhat passable SHO version of the Wizard Nebula. Now, since this started out as one thing and I turned it into something else, I'll go back and save as, and I'll change the name from HSO to SHO. Save that. Now I have two versions from the same data. If I wanted to do an OHS version, again, I would just go through the same process of changing the color channels that I'm choosing for each one of these groups. I've got a hydrogen group, an oxygen group, a sulfur group, and then a luminance detail group, some adjustment layers on top of that, this blank layer where I'm kind of cleaning up the background that doesn't matter, a very dark, around 15 or 17 point black layer in light and blending mode to create a uniform background, and then the stars on top of that to create the finished image. So the last thing I would do is go to Lightroom. I don't think I have that open, so it has to open. And I'll go to that 2022 photos folder that already has lots of other stuff in it. And it'll take a few minutes or a few seconds, probably not a few minutes, to get loaded up. And the last thing I want to do is load this into Lightroom for final tweaks, play with the color, play with the sharpness. I may add some noise reduction. And this is where I'll crop the image. If you notice, I haven't done any cropping until this point. And the reason I do that is I don't know what the final usage is going to be. If I'm going to put it on Facebook, I want one aspect ratio. If I'm going to use it as a screensaver, I'll do something different. So I don't crop until I actually get to the point of use. So here's my 2022 photos folder in Lightroom. I'll right-click and choose Synchronize Folder and click Synchronize, and it's going to go out and find any new files that have been added to that folder since the last time it was updated, and it should find just these two plus a couple others that are on the drive that are too large for Lightroom to handle. But by default, Lightroom can handle a PSB file. If you're having trouble with Lightroom seeing your Photoshop files, check that you have compatibility enabled in Photoshop. So I think the checkbox is actually called Maximize Compatibility. So there's our two images. We have our HSO version and the Hubble palette version. And looking at them here, I think I like the second one better. So I'll just go to the Develop module in Lightroom and see if we want to do any final tweaking here. I might darken the blacks just a touch, lighten the shadows, maybe lighten the highlights. I don't know if I want to, yeah, I may tweak the color a little bit. Let's give it a little bit of saturation. And I'm going to crop this now. And this looks like it'll crop nicely to well, no, it doesn't really quite fit into a square. So let's go to a 4x5. And it defaulted to vertical, so I'll tap X to switch to horizontal. I'll hold Shift and alternate to draw out from the center. And there it is. A little texture. Texture and clarity do a nice job of sharpening details. Texture really works on the stars, and sometimes I like a little negative clarity for the stars and negative texture to soften the stars a little bit. Positive clarity will sharpen the details in the nebula. And if I go to the Detail tab, in Lightroom, if you adjust the sharpening and then take your radius all the way down to 0 and your detail all the way up to 100, and then this masking I usually put in about the middle, and that keeps it from sharpening things in the shadows. This is actually doing a form of deconvolution sharpening. And then I usually throw in a little noise reduction just out of habit. And we might call that a finished image. I think I'll tweak the crop just a little bit. And what does this look like with a little vignette? I think I like a little vignette on it. So there we have it, a temporarily, anyway, finished image. I'll probably collect more data, and I'll certainly want to go back and capture RGB stars. But for now, I think I'm going to call this the end of the video. We walked all the way through from capture through processing in PixInsight, and now processing in Photoshop, and then finishing in Lightroom. I hope you found this useful. If you have, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments, either on Facebook or here in YouTube. And if you would like to rent some imaging time by the hour and capture your own data like this, you can contact us, contact me through Facebook or through the contact window or the contact option on the website, and we'd be happy to talk to you and help you get set up to do your own imaging of whatever target you're after. Thanks. I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.